Hello and welcome. This is Out Motorsports. My name is Jake and this is the 2020 Chevy Bolt EV. Yes, this is a 2020 model year Chevy Bolt that Chevrolet sent over for us to spend a week with, and that doesn't discount the fact that you can buy a new 2021 model year, and they've already announced the 2022 model year Bolt and larger Bolt EUV utility vehicle, which is more or less a slightly larger version of this hatchback body style. In any case, the drivetrain between the 2020 Bolt, the 2021 Bolt, and the 2022 Bolt is all the same, and a lot of my complaints that I have with this 2020 model are addressed by the 2022. So we'll get into that in a minute, but first, let's talk about where I'm standing right now, which is an Electrify America DC fast charging station. I live in a high-rise apartment building and I do not have access to fast charging or charging of any sort at my apartment complex. So while Chevy did drop this vehicle off with about half a charge on the batteries, that wasn't enough for me because I took this Chevy Bolt on a road trip, and it was not a road trip just across town, it was a road trip to see my parents. Negative tests, everyone's vaccinated, we're all in an okay spot to be doing this. It is about 135 miles from my front door to theirs, and there's not a lot of charging options along the way, so even though that's not really the biggest trip you could do in a Bolt, it was still a trip that had me a little nervous. And that's because, like I said, I have no way to charge this car at home. All I had at my disposal was this DC fast charging station here at a Target in Falls Church, Virginia. So, with that in mind, let's talk about what this Bolt is, what's coming up for 2022, what my charging experience was like, and then we'll get behind the wheel and see how it is to drive. All right, so starting out, what is the 2020 Chevy Bolt? Well, like I said, this is not the newest Bolt as of a few weeks ago. A few weeks ago, Chevrolet did officially announce the 2022 Bolt, which is going to be more or less a facelifted version of this Bolt, and in both cases, they are hatchbacks. They can seat up to 5 people. They've got decent cargo space behind that second row of seats, and the second row folds down to give you a flat cargo floor. Chevrolet also announced the Bolt EUV, which gives rear seat passengers a little bit of leg room and gives you a little more squared off, crossover-ish vibe if you just cannot handle the thought of driving a hatchback. In any case, this Bolt is the outgoing model. This one came out in 2016 and has looked the same ever since. Now, Chevrolet did do a couple things a few years ago that are important, one of which is that they updated the Bolt to allow more capacity in the battery. This battery can hold 66 kilowatt hours of juice, which doesn't mean a lot to anyone until I tell you it's good for 259 miles on a full charge. We'll get into that. Your mileage may vary, but the 2020 and 2021 Bolts can go 259 miles on a perfect day. In theory, they will do it. The other important change that Chevy made for the 2021 model year was making DC fast charging standard on the 2021 Premier trim. In the past, even if you got the Premier trim, which is the higher of the 2 trim levels on the Bolt, you had to pay $750 extra to visit one of these DC fast charging stations and actually access the fastest possible charging speed that the car and the battery and all of the electronics can handle. For 2021, if you get a Bolt Premier, it can do DC fast charging at no extra cost. Now, I thought DC fast charging was going to be this game-changing thing with the Bolt, and in this case, it still was, but not as much as I thought it was going to be. So depending on how you're going to use the Bolt, it really might be something that you don't actually need if you're looking a few years old. If you're looking to buy brand new, the other thing that Chevy did with the 2022 Bolt is they reduced the starting price of it down to $31,995. That is a $5,000 cost difference from this model's base price. So what that means is if you're looking at dealerships now, a lot of them have some leftover Bolt models that are brand new 0-mile cars with warranties, and they have to offer some pretty substantial discounts to move them off the lot because the 2022s are coming. So while this 2020 Bolt Premier with some options on it has an MSRP of 44 grand, you can find these at dealer lots for under 30 right now. The other thing that's important to note is that this car's drivetrain and battery pack and charging speed has not changed for 2022. The 2020 Bolt that I'm driving has a 200 horsepower electric motor that makes 266 pound-feet of torque, and it drives the front wheels. Like I said, all of that is powered by a battery pack that can do 259 miles of range on a full charge and charge at a speed up to 50 kilowatts. None of those details have changed about the upcoming 2022 Bolt. I had to charge at this Electrify America station before I set out on my road trip. The car was delivered to me with about half a charge on the battery, which is good for about 130 miles, give or take. I came to this Target, it's a few miles from my house, and I plugged in thinking that I would be in the store for about half an hour. And that is because Chevrolet says you can charge this Bolt with DC fast charging at 50 kilowatts and you can get 90 miles of range added to the car in 30 minutes. That's true if the car starts with a battery charge of 0%. The car can do 0 to 90 miles of charge in 30 minutes at 50 kilowatts of charging speed, but once you get to 90 miles of range, the charging speed is going to drop off, and in some cases it will drop somewhat significantly. So my time at Target actually took quite a bit longer. I was here for 52 minutes. Here's how that went. At our Electrify America station, and it says plug in first. So I'm going to take plug number 2 because of how this is situated. And these are kind of heavy cords. I'm gonna need 2 hands for this most likely, but all you do is line it up and push it until it clicks. Just like that. We're authorized. So this is now initiating, you can see here in the top corner, and now we're charging. Now this says it's gonna take 45 minutes left until we get to 80% of charge. I would like to get to 100% of charge, so you'll see it's sending power at 39 kilowatts right now.
1 hour later.
All right, so we're done, so I'm just gonna hit touch to return. I'm gonna hit stop. And you'll see the car says I have 176 miles of range now. So that's how it was charging this 2020 Chevy Bolt at this Electrify America station. Now these chargers can output up to 150 kilowatts of power, but the car has to be able to take it, and the Chevy Bolt can't do it. It can take up to 55 kilowatts. And again, that's only in optimal scenarios. This fast charging technology that's a part of the Bolt was pretty good in 2016, 2017 when these cars were brand new. As the industry marches on and technology grows and changes so quickly, this does feel a little slow to charge at this point. All right, now with all that, let's hop behind the wheel and see how this Bolt EV is to drive. All right, so driving the 2020 Chevy Bolt EV. This is not my first time driving an electric car. I've driven several Teslas. I spent a few days with an Audi e-tron at the end of 2019, but this is my first time living with an EV as if it were my own vehicle, and that's to say figuring out how to charge it, figuring out how it will suit my day-to-day needs, and it was pretty revealing. And like I said, I live in an apartment high-rise that doesn't have charging available, you know, in the parking garage. And of course, if you live somewhere like a townhouse or a single-family home where you could have a charger installed and reliably plug in where the cord reaches and charge the car every night, a lot of what I'm gonna say is completely irrelevant to you, but the experience of road tripping a 2020 Chevy Bolt is absolutely relevant because I don't think it's really the best car for that scenario. So to start with the charging, I learned a lot about charging. This is different than just pulling up to a gas pump with a gas-powered vehicle, sticking the nozzle in and, you know, picking whatever octane you need for your engine. With an electric car, you've got your charge rates based on the outlet that you're using. So in Chevy's case, they give you a charger to bring with you in the car if you're visiting somewhere like I did over the weekend with this car. And that's to say it's just a regular 120 volt 3-prong plug like you're used to in any sort of household device. And that will charge the car and give you 4 miles of range per hour that it's plugged in. That was actually pretty fine. I drove the car up there. I got there around dinner time. I wasn't planning on using the car again until lunchtime the next day. So that added 65, 70 miles of range, give or take. The next charging level that you can have is an at-home outlet that is a 240 volt outlet. That looks like a dryer outlet. It's the round socket that can push 30 amps or so. And you can have one of those outlets installed in your garage and hooked up to a somewhat fast charging scenario, so that if you own one of these cars, you can plug in every time you get home, and it adds about 25 miles of range per hour of charging. Now that runs at about 6.6 kilowatts of charging power. And so when you talk about charging power, normally you don't really need to worry about this because you're adding so many miles per hour of charge. But when it comes to fast charging, this is where kilowatts come in. So that 240 volt charger that you might have installed in your home that can give 25 miles per hour of charge runs at about 6.6 kilowatts. And the kilowatt rating is how fast the charger can shove electrons back into the car's battery. Part of that is determined by the charger. Part of that is also determined by the car. Even if the charger can output more power, the car has to be able to accept that power. And the car will actually dictate the charging speed. Part of that is determined by the car's electronics and what the architecture can support. Certain cars that are newer are able to accept a faster charge rate. No matter what the charge rate is, your battery has to be at the proper charge level and the proper temperature to accept the charge at that speed. And that's where the problem came in with DC fast charging. So Chevy claims that this Bolt can add 90 miles of range in 30 minutes. There's some caveats to that. You have to start with a mostly depleted battery because the 55 kilowatt charging speed, again, 55 kilowatts is how fast the charger can push electrons and how fast the car can take electrons. That only applies until you get the battery about half charged or a little further. Once you get it to that 50% or so state of charge, the charging speed drops down to about 30 or 35 kilowatts. And in my case, when I went to Target to charge this car before my road trip, I already had about half a charge, so I couldn't take advantage of that fast charge rate. I still got 35-ish kilowatts of juice, but it wasn't the fast charge that I thought I was getting. It still got to a pretty acceptable range. It got to about 80-81% of charge in about 51-52 minutes. Is this car great for road tripping? Not necessarily in that regard. For a lot of other reasons though, the Chevy Bolt is actually a pretty fun car to drive around. Number one, I mentioned the power and torque. This is a fairly compact front-wheel drive hatchback. You can fit 4 people in it, but this is a front-wheel drive car with a motor that produces 200 horsepower and 266 pound-feet of torque. Now, the benefit of electric cars is that electric motors put out 100% of their torque from 0 RPM. So off the line, leaving a red light, this thing feels really punchy. If you've driven or ridden in a Tesla, it's not going to be that level of throw you back in your seat, but it's pretty quick. And the other part of this is that the Bolt doesn't actually weigh all that much. This car weighs about 3,500, 3,600 pounds before you sit down in it. Almost 1,000 pounds of that is the battery. And with that 900 some pounds of battery, you have to mention that the batteries are actually in the floor. So the center of gravity here is really, really low, and it actually leads it to feel pretty nimble, pretty tossable, kind of anywhere. Like I said, you can just punch it and it will pick up pretty good. The interesting thing is if you've got the weather nice enough where you can have the windows down, even with the traction control system turned on, you can hear the front tires scrabbling for grip. The traction control does a great job, but you can hear them really trying to break loose, and there's not quite enough power and torque to make them do it, but they really want to. And like I said, all that weight in the floor makes it really eager to change directions because it's got that very low center of gravity. There's no real concern with like a gas car of having weight on the nose where the engine's up front. You do have some things up front under the hood where a lot of electric cars might have something like a front trunk. Chevy has actually put a lot of the controllers and modules for the electric propulsion system up under the hood, but it lets you have really good packaging elsewhere because your trunk floor out at the back is really, really low. So there's a lot of good storage in here. The other fun part of the acceleration in this is just the fact that it's a Jetsons car. You hear that sound, you hear that electric motor whining and whirring up, and that's the only noise you hear. It's just so fast off the line for that first like 40 feet. It's really goofy. Like I said, I was on a road trip with this car, and you know, 2 things that really matter to me for road tripping are suspension comfort and seat comfort. And in one case, the suspension of this car I thought was better than expected. It is reasonably compliant. It soaks up bumps well enough. It has a short wheelbase, so the ride can be a little choppy, but not all bad. It is very susceptible to crosswinds. I noticed that over the course of several drives. Not the most pleasant thing because you really do feel the car moving side to side. It doesn't take a lot of correction to keep it in a straight line, but it's a short wheelbase and a tall profile, and that doesn't really help things. As far as the seat comfort, Chevy has received a lot of bad press about these seats. Like I said, this is not the new Bolt. This is the older outgoing model. The seats are really not that great. They're firm, the cushions are very short, there's no lumbar support, there's just not much going on here. The 2022 Bolts will have an updated interior and a redesigned set of seats. Now, the other interesting thing with driving this Bolt EV is the transmission options that you've got. It's a, 1-speed transmission. There's not much going on here, but you have 2 options for forward propulsion. You have drive, which makes the Bolt operate like any other car. When you take your foot off the pedal, the car will continue to coast forward. And then you've got L, which I believe Chevy has marked for low. I think it's more like L for lots of braking. When you lift your foot off the throttle in low, the regenerative braking effect is super strong. And the fun part about it is that it really allows for one-pedal driving. So the car will slow down fairly aggressively and it will come to a complete stop. It's really neat because you can drive this car with just your right foot. And the number of times I've actually pushed the brake pedal in this car in the week that I've driven it is probably 5 or 6 times at most. You can stop from highway speed to a complete stop in a reasonable amount of time just by lifting your right foot off the throttle. If you need to slow down but keep moving, you just lift your foot a little bit but not all the way off, and the car does understand what you're going for. There's also a paddle on the left side of the steering wheel where you might find a shift paddle normally, and that will allow for even stronger regeneration, and it will slow the car that much quicker. So really cool. It's a great way to slow the car down and recapture some of that energy that would otherwise be wasted by slowing down. It dumps it right back into the battery. It's not good for a lot of range, but it does add up piece by piece by piece. As far as range, let's talk about range. Like I said, this car will do up to 259 miles on a full charge in optimal conditions. Optimal conditions are actually a fairly small set of conditions, as I came to find out. You really have to have no heat, no air conditioning going. You have to be going at a certain speed or below, because at highway speeds you use more energy, and you have to really be mindful of your driving. I drove this car like any other car. I was not really paying attention to the range, and I was able to get about 190, 200 miles out of it pretty easily. It's not the best highway car, just for all the reasons I've mentioned. The DC fast charging, if you're on a road trip, is not really at a speed that I would deem acceptable. The wheelbase, the fact that it gets blown around a little bit, the fact that you're using a lot of power at highway speeds, things like that, not super ideal. It'll do it. But if you're looking for a car that's primarily a commuter or, around town runabout sort of thing, the Bolt is a great option. It's a great size. The small size makes it easy to turn, easy to park. You can point and shoot little gaps in traffic. And if you can charge it at work or charge it at home, range anxiety is not going to be a thing with the Bolt, because 200 to 259 miles of range, somewhere in there, is really plenty for a lot of folks. So if you're looking for something that's on the more affordable end of the EV scale and used primarily around town or in a city environment, I really do like the Bolt for the reasons I've mentioned. If you're looking for a road tripper sort of car, I don't necessarily know if the Bolt is the one. All right, and that is it for this review of the 2020 Chevy Bolt EV. Thank you so much for coming along. As always, if you like what we're up to, please take a second and subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Be sure to turn on that notification bell so you don't miss the next video that's coming. We have a lot more coming down the pike, and we're very excited to show them all to you. And until next time, please stay safe, be well. We'll see you again soon.